Hi, everybody. Welcome to Inside Scoop with Sue. And today, I'm really happy to be back with Dr. Erin Weiner, but really sad to be talking about this and learning about this because it's devastating. So, Dr. Erin Weiner is a licensed clinical psychologist, an addiction specialist, and president-elect of the Society of Addiction Psychology. So, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. On the other hand, I hope one day we're talking about not this.
Maybe we could have like a celebratory chat about how this is not a problem anymore.
Yeah. Or at least some of this has been curtailed on a very high level. So the first thing I want to do is just talk about the overview of this epidemic. So my first question is, it seems to be something that's in the news so much more than it used to be because it became so prevalent. Is that impacting the situation in a positive way?
I think the fact that it's on the news is definitely impacting the situation in a positive way because awareness is what leads to, in my opinion, a reduction in stigma that leads to funding in terms of finding solutions and then being able to actually manifest those solutions so that things start to get better. But awareness is not enough, and that I think we've seen very clearly in that overdose rates have increased 9 out of the past 10 years, that just awareness alone is not enough. We have to have some pretty large scale, broad change in order to really turn the tide in the epidemic.
All right. Well, you wrote an article in Newsweek and you talked about 2 ways that teens end up down the path of opioid addiction and experimentation. So the first one is prescriptions for pain. So can you talk about that a little bit and how do we change that?
Yeah, for sure. So that particular path is sometimes it comes from, say, like having wisdom teeth out. It might be a sports injury, might be a car crash, but for whatever reason, someone gets prescribed opioids, and it might be actually warranted, as opioids are sometimes warranted for acute pain, but sometimes people are prescribed a bunch of opioids when they might only need a couple, or sometimes they're prescribed opioid painkillers when they could be using something else instead. Like, say, for example, a combination of Tylenol and ibuprofen, which has been shown to be as effective, if not more effective in some cases, in terms of controlling pain, as opposed to opioids. And so they're prescribed it. And once you start taking an opioid, there's some biological mechanisms that can kick in. And if those mechanisms are present, if some psychological mechanisms are present as well, it's very easy, particularly if you have a huge stash, for example, that you didn't necessarily need, to start using them for more than just the pain. And that's where things can start to grow out of hand.
So I have 5 kids and they all had some wisdom teeth procedures. And because I got smarter at this because of all the media coverage, when they offered 25 pills for $25 in the office. And I said, how many pills do you think my kid needs? And the doctor said 2 at most, because like for one kid, it wasn't even impacted. They were literally just taking out teeth. So I said, can I buy 2? And they said, no, we don't sell it that way. So then I went to the pharmacy where the pharmacist argued with me that I was making a mistake, only asking for 2, and I would not be able to come back and get more if we needed them. So, I mean, that's really hard to butt up against and stick to your guns and know you're doing the right thing. Is that tide shifting at all?
Really good question. I think the quick answer is yes. I think that if you look at the data, what the data shows is that the prescription rate and the amount of opioids that we're dispensing has gone down over the last 10 years. And we're starting to see some shifts there. Similar note, I was working with the orthopedic surgeons at Edward Elmhurst Health when we were working a couple of years back in terms of coming up with some prescribing guidelines. And there was one surgeon, and he said he wasn't the only one, who said that prior to making these changes, no matter the procedure that he was doing, like a hip replacement or a knee replacement, and then no matter the patient, could be someone who weighed 350 pounds or a 100-pound woman, he just would prescribe two different 80 pill scripts that he would give to someone. So basically everyone gets 160 pills. And that's just how he did it. Because previously the idea was, well, you just don't want to run out. The most important thing is that you're not stuck in outrageous pain and no way to deal with it. And so let's just make sure you have more than you need. And the problem is that there is actually a cost to that. And it's not to say that you should put yourself potentially in danger of being in this really excruciating pain with no safety valve. But at the same time, when your child probably only needs 2 pills and you're kind of being strong-armed into 30, there's probably a mid-ground there that's where we should be settling. A quick note, and we might get to this later in the broadcast, but if you, say, for example, really did need to get 25 pills, just because that was the system that you were in, you could also then at the same time purchase a disposal system, so that even if you have more in the house than you need, as soon as your child isn't in pain anymore, you destroy them safely, and then they're not laying around for someone to use improperly.
And how does someone do that?
Dispose of them, you mean?
Yeah, like you said, in a safe way. It's not throwing them in the garbage.
No, yeah, it's not throwing them in the garbage, and it's not flushing them either. That's not, the water filtration system. You could read some interesting articles about that, but it doesn't take it all out. There are disposal kits. The 2 brands that I'm most familiar with, and I think are the most prominent, are called Dispose RX and then doTERRA. And basically what happens is you take doTERRA, for example, is a pouch, and you put any pill, opioids or otherwise, into this pouch, which has some powder in it. You just add water, you shake it up, and it neutralizes the medication, basically turns it into an inert paste. And then you can throw it away in the trash as per normal. And so if you have, and Dispose RX works the same way, but without a pouch. You kind of have to bring your own pouch, like a Ziploc. But same basic idea, but the thought here is that, well, unlike with some pills like Benadryls or Tylenol or whatever it is that you just kind of store in your medicine cabinet until you need it, that opioids are meant to be used until they're no longer necessary and then disposed of safely.
Can you tell us some of the names of opioids?
Yeah, so there's a bunch, but the ones that are most common are so the generic name of the most common opioid you're going to run into is hydrocodone. And so the brand names that you might hear around that are most familiar are Norco and Vicodin. Those are both types of hydrocodone. That's the base strength in terms of how strong it is. We convert stronger opioids into a standard unit called a morphine equivalent dose. And so 1 hydrocodone milligram is the same thing as 1 morphine milligram. Another one that you'll hear pretty often is oxycodone or OxyContin. You probably have heard a lot about that. That was what Purdue Pharma was manufacturing and pushing and saying wasn't addictive. It is, of course. Oxycodone is about 1.5 times as strong as hydrocodone. If you go further up the ladder, Dilaudid is the brand name for hydromorphone. That's 4 times as strong as morphine. Heroin is a 1-to-1 in terms of how strong it is, but heroin you're not going to get from a pharmacy. That's something you would buy on the street. Another one you might run into is codeine that's combined with Tylenol. I think it's called Tylenol 3, something like that. But sometimes that's in cough syrup. You'll find codeine in cough syrup. That's a little bit less strong. The big, heaviest hitters right now, though, that you're hearing a lot about are fentanyl and then fentanyl derivatives. Fentanyl, you can get that as a prescription, although that's generally dispensed as a patch. And so it's something that you would put on, would be really slowly over time. But it's what's killing a lot of people right now on the street because it is 1,000 times as strong as morphine and heroin. Wow. And so a very small amount could be fatal.
So the first part of the story, the prescription part, to me is the one that parents have the most control over. Like I could fight to say, I either don't want it and I want to let my kid maybe feel a little pain and take Motrin and Tylenol. And even go to the pharmacist and know I'm right, that I only want 2 of those and just stand up for that right. You have the right to do that as parents. The next part is experimentation from teenagers, which I think is just so much more challenging for us as parents to know what to do. So, there's a component to experimentation that's peer pressure. And then there's a component, which you talk about both in the article, that's could be masking or treating mental illness. So how do we parent around those 2 issues?
Yeah, well, so I think it's also important to recognize that this route, which is very common in terms of how people, when we talk about the opioid overdose epidemic, there's kind of like two nexuses of people who are really struggling. One are teenagers and people in their early 20s who took this route, where they were experimenting or they fell into drugs because of their peer group, and they eventually started using opioids, and that led them to overdose. The ones who are dying from the prescription drug route generally tend to be more older individuals who were prescribed it, say, for example, for chronic pain. That is probably the most common way that people end up in that hole. But that's like an older demographic than this early one. To your question, though, the question of how do you stop kids from using substances in general, or how do you prevent that from happening, is really complex. There's a lot of different things as a parent that you can do, ways that you can structure your child's life, have them have strong prosocial connections to groups, have a good relationship with your child in general. There's a lot of science on that we can certainly dive into. But on the coping side, that one is a little bit more straightforward, where if your child is, say, for example, self-medicating depression or anxiety, or if they've had some sort of trauma in early life, there are ways to deal with that in healthy ways that are very supported by science, like, say, therapy. And I know that I'm a little biased being a therapist myself, but helping a child deal with their feelings in a healthy, sustainable way is key, and is something that, at least in decades past, we really didn't teach in school, and parents really weren't doing very reliably either.
All right. Well, I know that you said that you're not quite as familiar about access on social media, and you're going to tell us a little bit about the dark web. But I wanted to talk just a little bit about what I unearthed, and mostly because one of your teen parents sent me down this path that was so scary, that kids on social media, they're really being targeted for easy access to drugs that are laced with fentanyl and kill them. And Dr. Laura Berman, who is a psychologist, and I think was on some of the TV shows, she had 3 boys, and she lost her oldest son to fentanyl poisoning. And he purchased it on Snapchat. And she knows this because her son took a screenshot of what came across to him on Snapchat. And it's basically a menu like in a restaurant. And you just kind of order it. And it's really terrifying to think about the access that these kids have. And it gets delivered to your house, and you think your kid is safe, and then you find him dead. And the other part of her story is that her kid was experimenting with weed, and they got him into therapy, and they did random testing at home, and they did kind of all the things that we're told to do. And they were loving parents, and they had a good relationship with their kid. What do we do? This seems bigger than parenting.
Yeah. Well, it's really tough. And I think in some ways, I think a lot of us can relate to this idea of risk and risk tolerance and mitigating risk because of COVID times, where we think about, so like, what are we taking part in? What mitigation efforts are we doing? How are we minimizing our risk? But the risk is still there, particularly right now with, like, say, the Delta variant and any other future variants. Like, even say if you're vaccinated, there's still some risk in terms of this virus. The same thing is the case for substances and for kids with substances, where there are some best practices, and I'm sure we'll talk about what those are before our time is up today. But even if you do all the things right, or most of the things right, there's still a chance that your child gets exposed to something. I think one of Laura Berman's biggest pushes is to say, you need to be on your child's device. You really need to understand that there's a lot of dangers out there. And sure, not every joint is going to be laced with fentanyl. I think in her son's case, it was cocaine that he'd bought that was also laced with fentanyl. I mean, drug dealers are not trying to kill people. That's, like, those are their customers. But at the same time, when you start dipping into that realm of mail order drugs, either, whether or not it's from Snapchat or the dark web, or wherever you're getting it from, or even on the street, you never really know what's going to happen. And that opens the door to these really unfortunate situations where people end up dead.
I think I read this statistic that 1 in 4 pills are counterfeit, meaning that they're laced with some other kind of drug. And if you want to see what reality looks like in a world that none of us ever want to be part of, Laura Berman started a Facebook group, and it's called Parents for Safer Children. I think Jessica's going to put it up in the comments if she hasn't already. And just go there and read some of these horrifying stories, and you just go and have a conversation with your kid after that. So let's move on to now prevention. What messaging? We know that like telling your kids that they could die isn't something that's going to make them say, well, then I'll never do that. So what's the way to talk to our kids that's effective?
Yeah, so scare tactics are really easy to shoot down, right? And they're probably seeing something very different or hearing something very different when they're in their social media or on Reddit or even just peers at school, particularly in certain groups and subcultures there. And so ultimately, what you're trying to do as a parent when it comes to substances is start early. Particularly if you, and I know parents watching this, it might not be early for you. You might already be at the point where they're teenagers in high school, et cetera. But the earlier you can start talking with them before they might have these really solid opinions about substances that are coming from their peer group, to talk to them about the reality of this stuff. And about the fact, for example, that using cannabis, marijuana, THC products before your brain is developed has shown to actually physically impact the structure of your brain, for example. To talk about the fact that there might be some social benefit to using substances. There might be, to be honest about the fact that there's reasons why kids choose to do it. And at the same time, you need to be very thoughtful and careful about those choices, because although it might feel good in the moment or it might seem really important to fit into a peer group, if you actually play that tape out and you think about what is this going to be doing for you long term, that it's actually a very dangerous sort of thing, and it can be very hurtful. And hopefully getting them, because peer groups are such a strong influence. Second, I'd say only two parental opinions. And it's so important to talk to your kids about this and to make it clear what your expectations are, because that is, no matter what you think your kid thinks about you and your opinions as a parent, the research shows that they actually do take your feelings very seriously in the majority of cases. So make sure to have that conversation. But having them associate and form bonds with a more pro-social peer group where drug use acceptance is low, where the kids aren't using drugs, where it's not normalized, where they all have a perspective where they're wanting to do well in school, achieve at extracurriculars, keep their bodies and minds healthy, have a successful life. You really want to try to steer your child towards those sorts of groups, because your preferences and influences combined with those peer influences are going to be some of the most impactful reasons why they either do or do not make lots of choices in their life, including whether or not to try certain drugs.
So we get that piece of advice all the time. And as a mom, I'm wondering, I never had any power over their social groups. Like, how does that happen? My goal was for them to be with, I think you said prosocial.
Yeah.
That's of course every mother's goal, but I really had no power over that. So when we say that, what do you mean?
Yeah. So again, there's limits, right, to what you can do. These are kids are people too, and they'll make choices. What we're trying to do is put them in a position where they might form relationships and do things that are more likely to be positive. So, like, for example, things like being part of a drama club and putting on musicals would probably be more useful than, for example, just having bunches of free time and ending up at the parking lot where kids are vaping THC. Or if someone is involved in, say, like some sort of faith-based group, those tend to be skewed more towards these healthy, adaptive, pro-social activities, rather than the thing of, being accepted means doing drugs, or being accepted means vaping, or whatever it is. You're going to find that everywhere. But it's about trying to get to just in that deepest level, when someone comes in contact with these other influences, are they going to think to themselves, oh no, I want to try that, or oh no, that could actually hurt me, or that's dangerous, or that's harmful, or like, I'm not going to judge another kid for doing that, but I know where that can go, and that's not for me.
I love the suggestions, because it's kind of like find the thing that lights your kid up, and then encourage them to get involved in that, because then they'll be in a smaller group and with people who are aligned. So I think that's definitely one way. Okay, so let's move into, your kid is using. So, first of all, I want to bring up a question from one of our parents who wrote to me that her 14-year-old son is in a residential treatment center for substance abuse, which we wish her well, of course, and it's heartbreaking. But what I want to ask you is, how do you vet the right program? Because it seems like there's some out there that really do more harm than good.
Yeah, well, that is a really tricky question. And there's even fewer options in terms of where you go for children and most of the time than there are for adults. Those are even more specialized programs. The thing that you want to look for first and foremost is one or more accreditation seals by the agencies that accredit these sorts of institutions. So you're looking for the Joint Commission, you're looking for an organization called CARF, C-A-R-F. I'm forgetting what the acronym stands for at this point, but I remember CARF because it sounds a little silly. But that's another one. And then the Committee on Accreditation, COA. So one or more of those seals should be part of the way that they present themselves on a website. Ideally, also, if they provide data, that's a great sign. Like if they say, here are the outcomes from the work that we do, and they're not trying to hide that, and they're being forthright about here's how we gather, here's what we do, that's always a tremendously positive sign. Also, if you're looking through, and this is just a little bit of maybe a bias on my part, being a psychologist, but I always like to see if somewhere in the organization, in the leadership structure, there's someone with a PhD or a PsyD, because there's an adherence that you sometimes get to research and an understanding of research and a desire to incorporate new evidence-based methods into your work that's really drilled into you when you go and get a doctorate, that sometimes isn't emphasized as strongly if you don't. And so I always just like to see that there's somebody in the organization somewhere who might be reading those medical journals on a regular basis and who's been trained in that particular way. That doesn't necessarily mean that if there's not a psychologist on staff that it's not a good place to go, but that's always something, it's somewhere in the leadership structure that I like to look for personally.
Are there any red flags? Like, let's just say the place says that no communication with the parents, like they need to keep them separate and that's part of their program. Would that be a red flag to you necessarily?
Oh yeah, that would be a huge red flag. So the parents are, and having a collaborative relationship with parents is critical in changing this sort of behavior. If a child is really falling into substance use, generally speaking, what's going on, and I don't know if for the listener who posed the question, if this rings true for them, but usually there's some combination of one or both of the child has fallen in with a peer group where this is just part and parcel with what they do. And so they are getting a lot of positive reinforcement for doing those behaviors and being with those people. And that feels like their people. It's almost become part of their identity in a way. And so the idea of discontinuing that behavior is like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, why would I do that? This is, where I get my feeling of belonging and like I'm someone. And then the other part of it is dealing with some sort of mental health issue, whether or not it's depression or anxiety or, again, trauma or something like that. Usually one or both of those things are there. And so the most tricky part when someone's really falling deeper into substance use as a child is that the incentive structure for their behavior is usually totally reversed, where they are getting lots of things in their mind. They're getting a lot out of using substances. Like, this to them is a very rewarding behavior, socially rewarding, emotionally rewarding, all of it. And they look at their parents, and their parents just seem like a barrier and impediment. Whatever sorts of punishments are just getting in the way. And oftentimes the parents aren't really giving them any reason, giving the child any reason to work with them other than avoiding punishment, which is not necessarily the best way for people to learn either. And so the children, the whole family unit is usually embroiled in this backwards mess where the child continues the same behavior because it's actually better for them that way, even if it makes their parents mad, even if the family unit is completely disruptive and there's a lot of drama and chaos. They repeat it because it's still working for them. And so part of the process of change when someone's gotten that far is totally resetting that dynamic at home. And sometimes also drawing some boundaries with their peer group. And that can be very difficult to do sometimes. Sometimes if a child is really struggling with that, there are something called wilderness programs, where they will literally go into a therapeutic program in the wilderness, completely disconnect, no phone, all of the structures that they were so invested in and that were so unhealthy are gone. And they're just out there for a while so that they can learn to deal with what's going on without any of those things tugging at them before they then step into, like, say, a therapeutic school environment or a residential program, and then eventually back to the home. But the idea being that by the time they get back there, their way of looking at what the right and wrong thing for them to do is changed. Part of that process requires parents to be plugged in, because if parents are not plugged in, they can't support a new system, because like it or not, everyone in the family is part of that system, and it's probably not a healthy system if it's incredibly dysfunctional. And so the parents, as the leaders of the family, have to be the ones to take the lead, honestly, in terms of turning that around, and working with therapists to do that is really important. I ran on for a long time there. Thank you.
No, I'm really touched by it. I want to just point out, though, none of it, and I know Dr. Weiner doesn't mean it this way, none of this is blame. It's that the environment has to change for change to take place. So in that story, does moving, like either actually moving or like putting your kid in a new school when they come back from these programs, do you take your problems with you, or can that actually make a difference?
So it's a little bit of both. You definitely take your problems with you. And so if your child, again, if the family system, if the dynamic going on at home, and I want to echo what you said, it's certainly not the parent's fault. That's definitely not what I'm saying. However, there oftentimes are dynamics in the home that you might not be aware of that are perpetuating the cycle. And so being educated about that and how to change that is an important part of the change process. That said, if you take a child just out of an environment, move them to a new one, and have the same problems at home, have them have the same orientation about how my people are the people who use drugs, the way that I escape from my problems is by using, that will absolutely follow them to the new school. That's not going to be helpful. However, if your child does the work, you as a family do the work to the point where, like, things could get better, but then they go back to the old environment with the same peer group and the same pressures and the same triggers, it could sometimes be easier for the child to fall back into those old ruts when they're faced with those same environments than if they were in a new environment at that point. So there's no hard and fast rule to this, except for the fact that if you don't change the cause of the problem, what's going on inside, then the outside will just sink back to that if you change the exterior. But sometimes changing the exterior after you've changed the interior can be helpful.
All right, can you leave us with something hopeful?
Say that again, sorry?
Can you leave us with something hopeful?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Well, so if to leave you with something hopeful, so one, if this is something that your child is not actively involved in, there's still a lot of time and a lot of chances so that they don't. Again, it's about having a set point of what they feel is safe and acceptable behavior, what they want for their life. I guess just to give you an example. So when I was a kid, one of my neighbors, someone who I really looked up to, he was maybe like 4 or 5 years older than me. We would like play Dungeons and Dragons and like all sorts of stuff. But I mean, he was an important person for me. He went off to college and completely went off the deep end in alcoholism. And as a child, like, that scared the crap out of me, to be honest. Like, I saw that and I didn't think I want to be like him. I was like, oh my gosh, he's like falling asleep on radiators and getting burned and like really hurting himself. That's really scary to me. And part of the reason for that was that I had developed an orientation of being like, I want to be healthy. I want to have a good life. I want to be safe. It was less around like, I want to be cool, or I want to be like a certain individual, above and beyond that. And so if you're at a point with your child where you still, where they do have heartfelt conversations with you, they are open to what you're saying in particular, make sure to lean into that and truly talk about these topics early. Set the expectation, let them know about what's coming. Just as, once upon a time you taught them how to cross the street safely, and that was important in terms of how they manage themselves around roads. Talking to them early about substances is really important, particularly with vaping being on the rise and THC products being more and more present in our just everywhere, honestly. There's more and more reasons to talk to kids early about it. And if you're at a point where your child is experimenting, or even if things are getting to be pretty rough, know that these organizations that are out there, to help, that they exist for a reason, and they do help. I think one of the biggest barriers that parents face early in the early going, and this speaks a bit to what you were saying, Sue, is that they're almost hesitant to acknowledge that their child has a problem, because they think that it says something like deterministic about the child's future, like that, like your kid won't get better, or it's some referendum on you as a parent, like I'm a bad parent because my child is doing this. And because of that, they hesitate to get their child help, because it doesn't mean that you're a bad parent. And it doesn't mean that your child can't get better, but a lot of times people do need help. I mean, honestly, as a therapist, I work with adolescents and I work with adults. When most of what we talk about for the first month to 6 weeks of therapy are, here's how your brain works. Like, here's how your behavior and your thoughts and your feelings are all intertwined. Like, here are the basic principles of psychology. Now let's apply them to you. And the reason why we talk about it is that people aren't taught this. Like, we're driving around in our bodies and brains all the time, but we're not taught how they work. And when you know how they work, you can then influence how that whole system functions. And so if your child is struggling, there are reasons for that. And there's reasons that actually can be solved by a combination of helping them cope with their problems, changing that reward structure where they stop seeing that peer group as rewarding, as the family unit, changing some of the family dynamics. There's so much that we can do. And I guess the moral of what I'm saying, the main point is, don't be hesitant. If anything, like, be aggressive about caring for your child in this way. If you feel like your child might benefit from seeing a therapist and they're open to it, like, have them talk with a therapist. If they're having a really hard time and they keep going back to substances over and over and over, they might really benefit from a program, as opposed to just muddling along, doing the same pattern, and then maybe eventually being at a party where they run into some hydrocodone, where they run into some Norco or some Vicodin, or they start dating someone in that peer group who's using heroin or who's using methamphetamine or who's using cocaine. The sooner you can help them change their course into something that's healthier, the better the prognosis is long term.
And if you're at the moment feeling any shame about what's going on, go check out Laura Berman's Facebook page, and you will see that the support, the power is in the support and being out there talking about what you're dealing with. And Dr. Erin Weiner, I just want to thank you so much for taking your time to talk to us. And anyone who's confronting this right now, we send you our wishes and hopes for a better future. And this is tough. Thank you all for being here. Thanks, Dr. Erin Weiner.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.